Okay, so my next introduction is, the title is From Data to Diagnosis, Empowering Primary Care Through Quality Assurance in Chronic Infectious Diseases by Dr. Sofía González. And her synopsis is, she's a physician with extensive international experience in regenerative, functional, and infectious disease medicine, serving as a medical consultant at Baja Regenerative Medical Institute, which I assume is Baja California in Mexico. And she focuses on patient-centered care, diagnostic quality, and personalized therapy. Her career includes serving as chief medical officer aboard international cruise ships, and her mission really is to advocate for empowering primary care providers with evidence-based diagnostics and quality assurance frameworks, integrating functional medicine approaches to improve outcomes in patients with chronic infections and complex conditions. So welcome.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Well, I'm Dr. Sofía González, and I'm honored to join this conversation. Today, I would like to share a clinical perspective on how we can move from data to diagnosis and putting at the center or the core quality assurance. So especially in primary care, where early diagnostic decisions are made. There is no conflict of interest, and I will present only scientific content based on peer review, research, global guidelines, and clinical reflections, and I will not promote any commercial product or test. Sorry. Okay. My hope is that we will learn at the end of this talk, we'll basically understand how global quality assurance framework impact the diagnostic reliability in chronic infections, also to identify the clinician's role in selecting reliable diagnostic tools and interpreting the results, and to apply ethical and evidence-based strategies to empower patients through accurate diagnosis. We found that chronic infections are often defined not just by the duration, but by the complexity of the diagnosis or the diagnostic challenges they pose. Conditions like Lyme disease, Bartonella, and chronic viral infections share overlapping symptoms and ambiguous test results. And for millions of patients, a chronic infection isn't just an illness, it's a story of diagnostic limbo, as we've been learning from all these talks. According to Davis and colleagues in 2021, patients with long COVID experience symptoms from a median of 7 months before receiving proper care. These delays are similar for Lyme disease, and with diagnosis often relying on clinical suspicion alone in the early stages. As a clinician, I've seen it myself firsthand, the impact of these delays, the frustration, uncertainty, and missed opportunities for timely care. These delays doesn't just impact treatment, it also erodes the trust in systems, physicians, and in science. So this presentation is about how we can restore clarity and confidence in diagnosis through quality assurance. The aims of this talk is to demonstrate how quality assurance standards like ISOs and evolving frameworks like IVDR and the European Union or FDA regulations on LDTs in the US can guide clinicians in evaluating diagnostics and protecting patients. This is not just a lab topic, it's a clinical topic, and our role as physicians is crucial. Also, I would like to clarify that this presentation does not report on single study, but integrates clinical experience, regulatory frameworks, and published literature to synthesize practical guidance for the frontline clinicians. As we know, and we've been discussing during these 2 days, there is an invisible gap, and there is some data that we may ignore, right? So chronic infections often straddle multiple disciplines. A 2018 report from the CDC highlighted that over 40% of patients with myalgic encephalomyelitis were initially misdiagnosed with depression, fibromyalgia, and anxiety. Meanwhile, early Lyme disease can produce false negative results in up to 50% of cases, as Brand and colleagues noted in a Clinical Infectious Diseases in 2017. And these diagnostic gaps are not rare, they are systemic, and they reflect limitations in both the tools and the training provided to frontline clinicians. But there are some barriers to diagnosis. Let's look closer at the biology of them. For example, serology depends on antibody response, which may take 4 to 6 weeks post-infection to develop. PCR depends on detecting microbial DNA, but many pathogens, as we've been learning, Borrelia, Bartonella, or Rickettsia may localize in tissue rather than circulating blood. And the co-infections muddy the whole picture. Research shows that 30 to 60% of tick-borne infections may involve more than one organism, creating atypical immune profiles, as the previous doctor mentioned. These challenges must be accounted for, not just dismissed. And this is the core of the talk, is why quality assurance matter. Well, when we talk about diagnostic accuracy, we must remember that quality isn't a technical add-on. It's the backbone of patient safety. Globally, regulatory agencies are placing a stronger emphasis on how diagnostic tests are validated, manufactured, and applied in clinical settings. For example, let's begin with ISO 15189, which governs the competence of clinical laboratories. This standard doesn't just require internal quality control. It mandates participation in external quality assessment schemes, documentation of pre-analytical, analytical, and post-analytical processes, and traceability, as well as personal competency. For example, a clause 5.5.2 of this ISO requires that labs use only validated examination procedures that are fit for the intended clinical use. So it means that a Lyme disease test used for an early stage screening should be validated specifically for that stage, not just any positive control sample. Now, on the manufacturer side, we have ISO 13485, requires the in vitro diagnostic developers perform design validation, clinical evaluation, as well as post-market surveillance. In 2022, the European Union implemented an in vitro diagnostic regulation, IVDR, which is transforming the CE marking for IVDs from a self-certification model to one required notified body oversight for Class B through D devices. And those include chronic infections like Borrelia, Epstein-Barr virus, and Bartonella. So today, an IVD test used in the European Union must pass through a far more rigorous pipeline than ever before. And in the US, we have the FDA. Last year, finalized a new rule to bring the laboratory developed tests, LDTs, and that before were under enforced discretion to now be reviewed under a 5-year phase-in. So the same examples we can see in Australia. The Therapeutic Goods Administration updates its requirements in 2021 to enforce that IVDs used for self-diagnosis and chronic diseases management undergo post-market surveillance reports and not just pre-market testing. The same in the UK. Medicines and Healthcare Product Regulatory Agency has also proposed a reform pathway to align more closely to IVDR. And here's a clinical reality. When a laboratory or a test is ISO certified or approved under any of this, we feel safer because we know the test likely underwent to performance validation with real samples, lot-to-lot consistency controls, documented limitations, and external audits. And this is how quality transforms from the paperwork into trust. In an era of misinformation and patient frustration, diagnostic quality assurance is not just about compliance. It's about restoring confidence in science and medicine. So now let's look at what happens when quality systems are ignored or poorly implemented. This is shocking because according to the World Health Organization, diagnostic errors is responsible or are responsible for 50% of laboratory-related adverse events globally. This was reported in 2016. A 2015 review by the US Government Accountability Office found that many LDTs claim to diagnose chronic Lyme disease or cancer with no independent evidence of accuracy. The consequences of this is not just hypothetical. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, non-specific rapid dengue tests often cross-react with Epstein-Barr virus or cytomegalovirus, a fact that is also being documented by the World Health Organization since 2012. These are systemic weaknesses that erodes patient trust and leave clinicians like myself in difficult positions. Because when a patient walks in with a confusing test result, and I cannot trace its methodology, validation, or accuracy, I'm being asked to make clinical decisions on data I cannot trust. And in a world of complex chronic infections, that's not just dangerous, it's unethical. But there is good news. There is some regulatory evolution. Around the world, regulatory agencies are recognizing that we can no longer leave diagnostic accuracy to chance. In the US, the FDA has now made it official. Even laboratory-developed tests, those used in-house at specialty labs, will need to meet the same standards of evidence and validation as commercial test kits. In Europe, the new IVDR rule now requires independent review of most diagnostic tests, especially those related to infections, cancer, and genetic risk. Before, some companies could just simply self-declare their tests are safe, but this is no longer allowed. And in places like Australia, the UK, and Brazil, similar reforms are being adopted, moving towards systems where diagnostic products must show real-world accuracy and not just lab data. So, what can we do? We need to empower primary care clinicians. First, verifying the lab accreditation. It's very easy these days to find companies that just have great marketing, but we need to look deeper at what is they are offering. And we need to start asking questions and verify the lab accreditations. We could use as well clinical decision support tools such as symptom-based scoring systems because they will help us to navigate diagnostic uncertainty when test results or return negative despite persisting clinical signs. And most importantly, clinicians should feel empowered to ask, is this the right lab, the right test at the right time by the right lab? And this will help us to have a better picture of what we're dealing with. But there is something even deeper at stake. At the heart of this issue is a basic human right, the right to diagnose. The World Health Organization, the United Nations, and even national constitutions in many countries recognize that health isn't just about treatment. It begins with recognition of the condition itself. Without a diagnosis, patients remain in medical limbo. They are denied treatment, denied insurance coverage, denied legitimacy. The United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights states that health systems must be available, accessible, acceptable, and scientifically and medically appropriate. And this is the last part that is important. If we use tests that are not validated, if we rely on tools with unclear performance or ignore clinical signs because of a negative test result, we are violating that standard. And the harm is not just theoretical. We've been hearing this through all these talks. Studies in chronic Lyme, ME, post-COVID syndromes, and long-term vector-borne co-infections show that patients go undiagnosed from 1 to 3 years and are more likely to experience loss of employment, psychiatric misdiagnosis, social isolation, polypharmacy without clear indication. A 2020 survey from Solve ME Initiative found that 77% of respondents with ME were initially told their condition was psychological, delaying proper care for a median of 5 years. But there is some solutions on the horizon. Despite all the challenges that we discussed, and they are real, I would like to make myself clear that we are living in a transformational moment of diagnostic medicine because there is hope coming. First, we've seen a wave of smarter diagnostics. For example, multiplex tests allow the detection of multiple antigens or antibody subclasses in a single sample. This increases the likelihood of capturing atypical or early immune responses. Also, tissue-based PCR and next-generation sequencing. The same with artificial intelligence, because it could be used to reanalyze patterns of misdiagnosis in electronic medical record systems. Also can help us or suggest alternate diagnostic pathways in complex patients, or even predict likely infections based on geography, symptom clusters, and exposure risk. But technology alone isn't enough. We're seeing also a shift in how patients and clinicians work together. There is some initiatives like Solve-ME, LymeDisease.org, and international biobanks are enabling real-world data collected on symptoms, outcomes, and diagnostic journeys, as we've been learning during these 2 days. So this is my call of action. So what we can do. From the clinician side, we can ask where the test came from, check and verify if it's FDA clear, CE-IVD compliant, or ISO validated, document clinical reasoning when test results don't match the patient history, engage in shared decisions making because the patients are not adversaries, they are our allies in this uncertainty. For the lab leaders, to implement ISO certifications, not just to meet accreditation, but to improve the trustworthiness of every result that we release. And for regulators and policymakers to push forward reforms like IVDR and FDA LDT oversight, close loopholes that allow low-quality diagnostic to reach the clinic, and found collaborative research on hard-to-diagnose infections. And for all of us, we need to prioritize the patient. Choose courage over convenience and recognize that diagnosis is not just a label, it's a turning point in someone else's life. So this is what we've been learning so far. The laboratory errors remain a major threat. Evidence shows widespread lack of three-party validation, misaligned test usage in endemic regions, and emerging regulations are now demanding performance evidence. And let's all reflect on what this all means, not only for scientists and regulators, but also for us clinicians. We have clear evidence that diagnostic errors remain a pervasive threat in the care of patients with chronic infection diseases. Regulatory bodies are no longer tolerating diagnostic uncertainty. They are demanding traceability, ISO certification, clinical performance data, and post-market monitoring. And as primary care providers, we're often the first and sometimes the last to decide what test is done. This is where diagnostic integrity begins, not just with better labs, but with better informed clinical decisions. As an impact for science, practice, and patients, let's first clarify and how all this translates into impact, because this is not just a theoretical issue. Quality assurance, when implemented correctly, can transform the diagnostic experience for scientists, clinicians, and most important, the patients. For science, by demanding test validation and enforcing regulation, we elevate the standard of evidence in diagnostic research. For clinical practice, when clinicians are educated about the meaning of ISO certification and regulatory framework, they make better decisions. They choose tests not based on marketing claims, but on traceable evidence. This supports early diagnosis, fewer and necessary treatment, and reduces both over and underdiagnosis in chronic conditions like Lyme, rickettsia, and others. And for the patients, this is where the impact is more profound. Validated test means fewer misdiagnoses, faster access to appropriate care, and less emotional distress. They restore trust in medicine. In the end, this is not about adding more bureaucracy. It's about restoring diagnostic precision as a fundamental right for every patient. We own them that clarity, and we, as clinicians, are the bridge between regulatory science and real-world care. So I would like to close mentioning that diagnostic is not a checkbox. It's a moment of clarity in someone's medical journey, one that shapes their access to care, their mental health, their family dynamics, and their sense of self. And as clinicians, scientists, laboratory professionals, and patients advocates, we each play a part in protecting that moment. Thank you for your attention, your commitment to diagnostic integrity, and for being part of a future where every patient has the right to be heard and to be diagnosed with dignity.
I can start with one actually. So,
Go ahead.
You touched upon the importance of quality management system with the different ISO numbers, but while these information should be public, not many labs or providers make it public, so it's usually confusing for the doctors and the patients. So how would you recommend them to navigate this? Because everyone is looking for tests, but they're also looking for reliable tests and reliable institutions.
Well, first, as clinicians, I hope I planted a seed to start looking into what these certifications are, and you can use that next time that you are visited by a company that is talking about a test. And so there is some even checklists that you can have in hand and evaluate through that lens every single testing company that shows up.
Okay, I think we have an online, it's a comment from Olivier. Excellent, yes, integrity and ethics do matter. It's the golden standard to evidence respect to all patients. So it was probably a comment, not a question, but thank you, Olivier. Any more questions?
If you allow me just to mention that we've been learning a lot about this, and if we want to be taken serious for all those neutral experts, right? We need to rely in science-based tests so we can have an impact and change the direction of all these chronic infections. Because if those that are neutral, it's because of lack of information or because they believe the test don't have rigorous science behind, it will be very hard to change the narrative. Thank you.
Thank you.